Good morning. Starting a new summer sermon series. It's on the forgotten figures of the Bible. Interesting, unique, sometimes minor characters of the Bible that teach us important lessons, both positive and, in the case of today's story, negative, the things maybe we shouldn't do. We're going to start this series on forgotten figures of the Bible today with Samson. So, in Samson's particular case, his story covers 4 chapters in the book of Judges, Judges 13 to 16. The sermon's going to take you through sort of the high points of his life, but I would invite you to pause now and read through Judges 13 through 16, and then come on back with me. So I still remember the first time that I heard the story of Samson. It was when I was a young person in Sunday school, and we were shown a cartoon by our Sunday school teacher about the life of Samson. And then afterwards, I think we illustrated his life on one of those felt boards. If you remember those treasures from another era, the felt boards. To me as a kid in Sunday school, Samson was a superhero. I mean, he might have come straight off the pages, might as well have come straight off the pages of a Marvel or DC comic. He was a superhero. I'm a man of incredible strength, almost like the Hercules of the Bible. But after going back and studying Samson, Samson was a deeply troubled man. He had tremendous gifts. He also really struggled with knowing how to use those gifts. So let's dive into his story today and hopefully learn a little something about our own lives, our own story as well. So let's begin just with the context, and that is the book that the story of Samson falls in. It's the book of Judges. Now, that's not a book we read very often. Judges, why is it called Judges? Well, Judges refers to the story of 12 leaders of Israel who were said to have judged. Now, the judges were not like today's judges who read and interpret laws. These judges ruled. That's what it meant to judge, to rule the land and the people. And they did so. These 12 in particular ruled in very difficult times. There was a constant cycle that was repeating itself. The people sin. God sends a judge to try and save them. The judge ends up falling into the sin of the people. The people sin some more. God sends another judge to try and redeem them, and the cycle just continues. It seems to get worse with every ruler until, at one point, it all falls apart. And that is with Samson, who is the last judge God sends in this particular era. Now, Israel was being ruled at the time by a group of people called the Philistines, who lived on and along the sea. Now, Philistine rule was seen as a judgment from God for Israel's sinfulness. But God didn't give up on them. Remember that cycle we talked about before? God always sent another judge. That's what happened in this case. An angel visited a woman who could not have children. The angel told her that she was going to have a son, but there were a couple of conditions that needed to be met. 1, no wine or alcohol. 2, no cutting hair. And 3, nothing ritually unclean. And if you follow these 3 rules, the angel tells her, the boy will be the one this boy that you have will be the one that delivers Israel from the Philistines. And so, in time, this woman had a son, Samson. He grew big. He grew immeasurably strong, and the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, the people in those days said. Now, one day, Samson falls in love with a woman. But it's not just any woman. He falls in love with the Philistine woman. The people who were his people, sworn enemies, and his parents say to him, how about a woman who's more like you, more like us? Why does it have to be a Philistine that you fell in love with? Samson had already made up his mind. So they traveled to this woman's village. Along the way, a lion attacks Samson. Samson literally tears the lion in two with his bare hands. That's how strong this guy is in the story. Now, they get to the village. Some things happen along the way, but eventually he and his beloved decide to get married. And in the 7 days leading up, the 7 days of feasting leading up to the wedding, so fathers, side note here, if you think you have it bad now paying for a wedding, imagine paying for 7 days of feasting leading up to a wedding and paying for that and a wedding too. Could be worse. So in those 7 days of feasting leading up to the wedding, Samson challenges the Philistines, his people's sworn enemy, now about to be his family, to solve a riddle. And this riddle is connected to that lion he killed the first time he was on his way to their village. But the Philistines could not solve it. So they asked his fiancée to find out the answer. And she tried and she begged and she kept asking him to tell her the answer. She begged him for 3 days. He wouldn't say anything until finally she begs and she begs and she begs, and the people beg and beg and beg her. Samson snaps about it before the wedding. He felt the Philistines had taken advantage of his wife by trying to solve this riddle via her, and he thought that his future wife had tried and taken advantage of him in solving this riddle. So he slaughtered 30 of them over a riddle. And he goes home. He leaves. Now, sometime later, Samson comes back to that village to see his wife. He wants to try and make things right. But her father would not let him inside the house. He explained that she'd taken another husband because of what happened. And then the father offers another one of his daughters to Samson, which is strange on several levels. But again, Samson snaps. He snaps when the father says that he's not allowed to see her any longer. So Samson gathers up 300 foxes, ties a torch to their tails, and sets them free in the Philistines' wheat fields. All the village's food was destroyed. The Philistines all descend upon Samson at one time to try and stop him. Samson looks around for a weapon. All he could find laying on the ground in front of him was the jawbone of a donkey. With that jawbone and his supernatural strength, Samson slayed over 1,000 Philistines that day. That's what the story tells us. Is Samson a hero? Was this the purpose for which God called him into existence? Was this how he wanted Israel to be liberated from Philistine rule? With that violent outburst, the prophecy was fulfilled and the Philistines were defeated, and Samson and the Israelites were in control of their own destiny once again. Samson went on to judge Israel for some 20 years until he fell in love again, also with a Philistine woman. Her name was Delilah. Now, the Philistines had been waiting for their opportunity to try and take revenge on Samson for what he had done. But they also knew how powerful he was. So they convinced Delilah to find out what made him so strong. Sound familiar? So each day, Delilah would ask him, "What makes you so strong, Samson?" And he told her this whole series of lies about the source of his strength. Again, another example of what not to be. He's got relationships that are constantly built on tests and lies. And so every time she did what he told her would remove his strength, he said, "Oh, if you tie me up with this specific kind of cord," and told her all these lies. But every time she tried it, of course, it failed because it was a lie. She figures out that he's lying. Delilah accuses Samson of lying to her. And then Samson snaps in a different way. He snaps and he tells her the truth. He says, "It's my hair. If you cut my hair, I'll lose my strength." So she cut his hair, and he did. He lost his strength. Philistines arrested him. They gouged out his eyes. They chain him in shackles, and they take him as a prisoner. This was the part of the kids' cartoon that I remember so vividly. I remember the enslavement. The cartoon didn't talk about why Samson ended up in this position. As a child, I felt so deeply sorry for Samson. Seeing the world's strongest man enslaved and shackled was enough to make any kid depressed. But again, I ask you, is Samson a hero? Was he acting like God's judge? Soon thereafter, the Philistines brought Samson as the entertainment for a party. It was a huge party. Thousands of people there. And they were all there to set their eyes upon a man who killed their ancestors as he stood in shackles. This was a day that they had waited for a long time. Samson prayed to God for his strength to return. Specifically, he prays to God that he might gain revenge on the Philistines for what they did to his eyes. So he began to push on the pillars of the house with all his strength, and he said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And as he said that, and as he pushed, his strength returned, and the whole house came crashing down, killing Samson and all the Philistines who were inside. And as the scripture says, he killed more in his death than he did in his life. What in the world are we to make of this story of Samson? It is not the cartoon that I watched as a kid where Samson uses his strength for God's good purposes. I understand why they tell the story that way. That's not the way the story goes. I think the story of Samson is a cautionary tale. There are plenty of biblical stories that tell us what to do. There are some that show us what not to do and who not to be. How can a man so strong in body be so weak in spirit? Samson does awful things. Repeatedly. He used the gifts that God gave him for his own purposes. And look where that left him. It left him blind, in prison, and praying for revenge as he murdered thousands of people. Samson's story teaches us that the gifts we've given don't mean much if we don't use them for God's good purposes. Think about Samson. Samson is strong. He's handsome. He's charismatic. He's a judge of the nations. He's gifted beyond measure. Had the whole world at his fingertips. Yet Samson used his gifts for his own glory, and it literally came crashing down on him. Reminds me of the old saying, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because Samson could overpower his enemies didn't mean he should, or that's what God intended his strength to be used for. He didn't know how to use the gifts which God had given him. May we all be humble enough to ask for God's guidance in using God's gifts for God's glory, not for our own. Amen.